When you talk to MSP owners about how they get started, you'll hear some of the wildest, most unexpected stories. Some started by fixing computers in the basement, others just stumbled into it and made it work. But then you have people like Joe Goldstein, who not only built a top ranked MSP, optimized computer solutions, but also literally wrote the book on using technology as a competitive advantage. Joe has over 30 years of IT experience, deep expertise in healthcare, IT, and HIPAA compliance, and a history of building a high performance tech teams. So today, we're diving into his journey, the wins, the challenges, and the moments that changed it all. Let's get started. Joe, thank you for joining me. Before we get into your journey, let's start with something fun. So, if 10-year-old you knew what you did for a living, what would he say?
Good morning, and thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to this conversation. If it was 12-year-old me, 12-year-old me would be saying you're doing exactly what you thought you wanted to do at 12 years old. I'm very blessed in that very early on in life, I knew exactly what I wanted to do when I got a chance to work on a computer when I was 12 years old. 10-year-old me would think that I'm living the age of the Jetsons because nothing like what exists today was even imaginable back in 1978, I guess it would be for a 10-year-old me looking at the future, definitely never knowing what I would do for a career or where I would be today.
Yeah, it's amazing looking back that it was even possible to have a career in something like computers because back then it was a hobby. I remember getting a book at Radio Shack on how to program in BASIC and making all sorts of great things. I thought they were brilliant and thinking, this is what I should be doing. I really enjoy this. And having people tell me that's a hobby, that's a game, that's not a career.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up Radio Shack because Radio Shack actually played a big part in my life. My dad worked at Radio Shack and would bring home the kits. And for those that are too young to know what Radio Shack was, because you can still find them here and there, you would basically buy erector sets of electronics and you would have to put them together, which includes soldering. And in some cases back then, it was using tubes for some of the products. And my dad had a voltmeter that I remember very clearly using. That was a kit that he bought from Radio Shack and put together. And we had it for years and years. And that engineering background that he had, I think played a big role in what I'm doing today because he brought home a color computer, a trash 80 color computer from Radio Shack. And that's how I started to learn. That's where I started to learn how to code, programming in BASIC. I learned that things are not perfect, even though they're published. I would get a magazine every month and there would be programs in there that I would use my two fingers and type them in and had to leave the computer on because I had no way of backing up what I was doing. So if my mom vacuumed that week or that afternoon after I was done, I would lose everything that I did until my dad got a cassette recorder. I think it was a few months later that I could save programs to. And the programs, when they came in the magazine, they weren't complete. Sometimes they had bugs. And so at 12 years old, I was learning not only how to use the computer and program in BASIC, but to also that's what was the beginning of my troubleshooting skills was at 12.
Yeah. And it's such a great skill to have, especially at that age, to think, wait, this isn't working. Is it me? Did I make a mistake? And then going back and being so meticulous and making sure everything's right. And then finding, oh, wow, here it is. And you felt so powerful. I know having that moment as well. It was great. Also, went through the losing a long program in BASIC because my mom vacuumed. But it took me a couple days of crying because that was an 8-hour project that just was gone in a flash. But it still was good. It was a great song about cats with great colors. It was lovely. It would have changed the world.
Yeah. The relative ease of technology today compared to what it was when we were working on it back in the early 80s compared to what it was like in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. It's been an incredible ringside seat to technology, at least from my perspective, being able to watch it grow because I started right at the personal computing age, right? Things where you could bring a computer home. That was very early on in 1980 and being able to watch how it's progressed since then, having that ringside seat over 5 decades of watching technology has been really cool.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. So, one of the things I love asking MSPs is how they got started. Because most people say their story isn't interesting. And I happen to know some of yours, and I think it's super interesting. And I think you said something similar. It was like, it's no big deal. And then you told me this amazing story. And so, how did your journey into IT and MSPs begin?
I had been working for a Fortune 500 consulting company. I was working as the CIO on the consulting side for large hospitals at the time. And I was working for a hospital in Dallas. Had a conversation with the client, and we had been not holding up our end of the bargain, I'll say, contractually. And the client, who was very savvy, one of the few very savvy healthcare CIOs at the time that I had encountered, kept pushing me on this. And eventually I just told him the truth. And my company was not very happy that I shared the truth, which was basically I couldn't hire the 3 people I was supposed to hire because we were in a hiring freeze. Organization wide, I couldn't hire them because I wasn't allowed to. It didn't take about 5 minutes after our meeting that day for him to start going up the flagpole and saying, "Hey, what is this? I just had this conversation." And it wasn't more than a couple of weeks later that I found myself going from being handpicked. They had rejected, I think, 4 or 5 other candidates before they picked me for that role. And going from handpicked for the role to saying, sorry, we no longer want a traveling CIO. I was living in California at the time and the job was in Dallas. So that was October of 2008. And if you recall, 2008 was probably not the best time to become unemployed. Things were tight. Things were not going well in the world at that point, and jobs sometimes were very hard to come by. I had a brand new family. I just gotten married that previous July. And I'm like, okay, I'll go find another job. I've never really had an issue with finding a job. And so I started looking. I spent 8 hours a day looking for work for a few months. And during that, I have to make ends meet. So my wife and I had been watching Storage Wars quite a bit. It was very popular at that time, which is where you go and buy abandoned storage units. And we also discovered another revenue stream, which worked pretty well for us. We went to go buy bikes for our kids. And we came across this gentleman who was selling used bikes. And he had literally an acre or more of just used bikes. And so we found a couple of nice ones and we were interested in them. And we asked him, where did you find all these bikes? And he's, oh, well, there's police auctions and they sell bikes in lots. And take the lot, pick out the 1 or 2 good ones, and I resell them. And on the drive home, my wife, instead of buying his bikes, why don't we just go to the police auction? So that's what we did. We found the police auction where he was buying his inventory, which, by the way, when he spotted us picking up bikes one day, he was not very happy. But because we actually ran into him one day when we were picking up a lot. And the trick was my wife would go online. We would look. We found out what the higher end bikes were. And you could have a lot of 2 or 3 bikes. You could have a lot of 15 bikes, or sometimes they sold ones individually. And the idea was to buy the lot or the 1 or 2 good bikes in it. A lot of the bikes were like Walmart bikes, so they weren't worth putting any money into to fix. But we would fix the higher end ones. And it got to the point where I had so many to fix, I couldn't do it on my own. I turned the garage into a bike shop, hired a bike mechanic. And the bike mechanic was working on the bikes, getting them ready to sell. So we would take all the bikes that were in decent working order, whether they were Walmart bike or and the high end bikes, and then take that along with items that we bought in a storage locker sale. We go and go to the auctions, buy storage bins, and we take those to flea markets and farmers markets and sell there. And that's how we got through Christmas of 2008, was out there just hustling, making ends meet and doing stuff while I was looking for work. After the new year, I think it was April or May, it was May of 2009. My wife comes up and says, I'm really just tired of watching you look for work. Go do something. Just, you're too talented. Go do something. And so I thought to myself, I'd always wanted to start a business. It was something I had always thought about. I'm like, all right, so I'll do that. First ad, like I'm sure many of us, was Craigslist back then. And I'll come and fix your home PC. So I went from being a CIO where I migrated, I think, I managed a project to move 800 servers from one data center to another, migrating all the data. And getting it done on time and ahead of schedule and without data loss, et cetera, to the guy that was going around to home PCs, wiping viruses and porn off of people's PCs. My wife
So
hates that part of the
important.
story when I tell it that way, but it is the truth.
Yeah.
I have a really interesting story of that time.
Yeah.
A gentleman called me and says, I need you to come and fix my computer. I get there and he says, you have 1 hour. And then
Whoa.
you have to leave. I'm like, okay. So I get on his computer and I figured out very quickly why I had an hour. His wife was coming home in an hour and he was very infected with things and sites that he had been visiting that he might not have should have
Whoa.
been visiting. And I remember just barely getting wrapped up, and it took forever to get control of that PC. It was slow, had a lot of issues. Finally got it working. And literally, as his wife is driving into the driveway, he's ushering me out the back door and around the gate so I can leave. And so she would be none the wiser. One of the more entertaining stories I have
Yeah. You
from
can't
that.
make that up. That
You
is
can't make that up. That's how Optimize was born. A month later, I got my first business client
Mhm.
who asked me if I knew Citrix, which I didn't. And of course, I said, yes, I do. And one thing I know you're probably going to ask later what it is, advice. And one of the
Wow.
best pieces of advice is you bet on yourself. I bet on myself over and over again, my ability to learn things quickly, my ability to say, yes, I can do that.
Mm.
And knowing damn well that I'd never done it before, but knowing that I can figure it out.
Yeah.
And so that trait has served me well, especially early on. So I learned the software. I think it was Citrix back then that I had to learn for that client. And that was my very first business client where I actually was starting to make a little bit of real money.
That's great. That's great. I love how you proved to yourself that you could be a business owner, even though you weren't really thinking that the bike part of your life was a business, but it really was. And that was so cool. And I think it was maybe your little confidence boost that you needed to take that next step. So, what was the turning point when you realized that Optimized Computer Solution wasn't just a small shop, but was a real business?
So that happened a little bit later on. I got my first real big break. And the next step, I can tie the last 14, 15 years of kind of what we've done back to this next step. I got a phone call to interview for, I think they called it a project manager position, a technical project manager for a hospital group. But that hospital group was in New Jersey and it was an on-site project, but it paid well.
Mm.
And I interviewed for it. I got the job, but the agreement was that I had to move to New Jersey, talk to my wife. And it was real. I think at the time I think I was getting paid $100 an hour all in. I'm like, I'd be crazy to turn that down, even if I have to move away and come home. So I moved to New Jersey, got an apartment, shipped our truck out there, our expedition, and came home every other week. I got to know the Philadelphia and LA airports very well and the schedules very well during that time. The people that I met during that time when I was at that hospital system would later prove to be very valuable as I started to grow OCS outside of just working that contract.
Yeah, that's amazing. How did you even deal with that kind of jet lag? That is no coast to coast flights are not
I
an
had traveled quite a bit for work, especially with the Fortune 500 doing the consulting. I traveled
Mhm.
a lot during that time. And you do what you have to do. And that really is what it boils down to. My family would come out and see me when the kids were on breaks. So they would come out and they'd spend Christmas with me, and they would come out over the summer and they'd stay 2 months over the summer, and we would explore the East Coast. Doing what I do is one of the reasons that my children, by the time the oldest was 15, had been to 35, 40 states.
Wow, what an experience for them. That's fantastic. That's
Yeah.
great.
The working in Jersey for a year catapulted into some other opportunities. I got a phone call about a year later from one of the directors of a surgery center that I had done work for.
Okay.
And she had just become the new CEO of an ENT in New Jersey. At that time, I think they had 10 or 12 locations, and their current MSP or current IT group, whatever, was not doing well by them. And we were getting ready to really bend them over a barrel as far as support.
Mm.
And she called me in. I talked to her. I presented to their board and basically stood up in front of 12 doctors and said, trust me,
Mm.
you don't know me. I can get you off of their systems and save you a lot of money. I think the estimate over the first year was that we were going to save them about $1 million in IT services. And at the time it was just me. And they're like, oh, what happens if something happens to you? And I don't remember what I said. I came up with some song and dance to make it sound not quite as bad as it probably would have been. And we got the contract, and then
Mm.
the timeline shrunk. The previous vendor was very upset that they were leaving and started charging them like 4 or 5 times their rate.
Wow.
So my timeline went from, I think, a 6-month timeline to a 2-month timeline
Huh.
to build out an entire environment to host their EMR, host their other on-prem applications, their mail. The week before Thanksgiving or the week leading into Thanksgiving in a data center. And if you've ever spent any time in a data centers are one of my favorite places. I love data centers. I started my first data center. I saw step foot into in 1997, I think, and just absolutely love being in them. But it's like being in a casino. The
Mm.
lights go off. You never really know what time it is because there's no clock in the data center as a general rule. And during that time, I was building out basically a full rack of equipment, starting at firewalls, switches, servers, storage, everything, building it from scratch by hand back then. And I was probably working 18 to 20 hours a day and going to the room just long enough to sleep for a few hours and then come back. When I left there, my wife knew I was really tired. And I flew from Jersey back to California. Sitting, I had my car there. She's, you're not driving home. She sent a car for me. She sent a limo to the airport to pick me up. And I fell asleep on the ride home. I was so exhausted after, but got it built,
Yeah.
got it ready for them to go. And I remember on New Year's Eve coming in because I was in Jersey because we were going live on the first, talking to the CEO, and she either we swim together or we sink together because we're going to flip the switch. And things went well. We came online. Everything went very well for as much work that went into, because I think we flipped their phone systems at the same time. We did all sorts of stuff that all at one time to online. And we saved them over $1 million that year. One of the things they did is they recovered a lot of outstanding billing because this group was doing some really strange things with their insurance claims, but it all worked out. And from there, that was the beginning of my work and specialization in otolaryngology with ENT practices and audiology.
Yeah. And I think first off, what an amazing feeling that must have been. 6 months of work into 2 months is just
Yeah.
an accomplishment. And to have it go off swimmingly is just brilliant.
One of the things, this is going to sound really tacky. I was on vacation. We were at the Grand Canyon with the kids, and I was expecting a check from the client to help cover the costs for all the stuff they were doing. And it was a 6-figure implementation that we were doing.
Yeah.
And I got our first check from them, and I was very upset because the check was for $99,975 or something like that. And I wanted $100,000 check. I wanted that check to be over 100K, and it was just south of 100K. And that was the biggest check I'd ever held in my hand at that time, the biggest project
Wow.
I'd ever done. And we had already exceeded anything that I thought was possible with starting a little computer business, right? And moving forward. And especially her family, her mom, very old school. What can he do sitting in a chair at a desk? Right. It, beyond her, right? What could be done? And I had a new family, and a lot of the family was very skeptical
Mm.
of the ability to support my wife and 3 kids.
Not after that.
You just sitting in a chair, not really going out and doing much,
Yeah.
but it worked out.
It definitely worked out. And one of the things about your story that you've always been in the healthcare field and staying close to that vertical, and then even further specializing it into ear, nose, and throat. And when you were talking about sitting in front of that board of doctors, you had a leg up anyway because you spoke their language. You had been in that for some time. And that's what's so great about having a vertical and not just being okay at a lot of things, but really understanding this market, this vertical. And I think that's really served you well with the ENT vertical.
It has. And I wish I could say it was part of a master plan, but it just happened, or it happened organically. When we did a good job for the group in New Jersey, they started talking to other groups, and they introduced me to a very large group here in South Florida. And we engage with them. They're still a very good client of ours. And the CEO of that group is not just a client, but he's also a good friend. From that, being involved with the organization that serves that community and being able to do speaking engagements there and engage with the community over the last decade has led to our ability to grow in that area. And now 90% of our revenue is driven through that specialty.
Yeah. And that's another great tip right there is getting out and being a subject expert, getting out and speaking at events where your potential clients could be, not looking just to make the sale, but just to give information and help the community out. That's a great idea if people aren't doing that. One of the things I see all the time with the Gozynta Growth Program, MSPs that are starting out, the business starts to gain a bunch of momentum. And then suddenly they realize, whoa, this is a real business and it needs systems and strategies and a plan. Did you ever have that moment of, whoa, okay, I have all these people here. And now what? Now what do I do?
Yeah, as we've grown it's probably more over the last 2 or 3 years, especially. There was a time where I was doing most of it by myself. I'd had people that had cycled in and out that would help and never really had great success with staff, unfortunately, up until about 2 or 3 years ago. And I could tell you for every environment down to the server, the function that it did, the network, I could draw the network scheme for all of the different clients. And it all just set up in the head. And I come from a world where documentation was key when I worked at Intuit in the 90s. If it wasn't documented, you were getting paged in the middle of the night to fix whatever your application you were responsible for. Because if the NOC couldn't take care of it based on the documentation you left, they were waking you up. So your motivation not to get woke up was to document.
Yeah.
But we had some level of documentation, and it's an area that we probably could still do better in today. I would argue that most MSPs can do better in their documentation as a general rule. But yeah, as I've moved farther away from doing the day to day, that's when it really starts to hit you that all those things that you've kept up in your head, you're going to need to find a way to get out and get them down to where others can use it and don't need to rely on you, because you just become the big gate. You become the gating factor to so many things. And so my job right now is to work very hard to remove myself as the gating factor to making sure things progress.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. One of the things that is great motivation for that is eventually you can take a vacation and not have to constantly be looking or giving answers. That's always a great motivation when you can take a couple weeks off and no one needs you.
I took my first vacation in 15 years, 2 years ago. I went for a cruise for a week. And that was the first time that I'd gotten away and got away from the computer. I still had access to the internet if I really needed it, but I tried not to. I spent a good portion of that vacation underwater on dives and just in general not being available.
Fantastic. Fantastic. So on the other side, every MSP has had that, oh crap moment, that time when everything almost fell apart or you thought, I don't know if we're going to make it. What was that moment for you?
There are several nights that I would lay in bed wondering how we were going to make ends. I don't know if there's a single moment in time for me, but I do know that there are a lot of sleepless nights, especially early to mid through running the company. How are we going to do this? How are we going to pay this next bill? What are we going to do to meet this need? And not only that, the bigger issue for me was I was building this thing that every year seemed like it was much bigger than I had ever thought was possible when I started. And I gave it a name and I called it feeding the monster. You got to constantly feed the monster. And it's exhausting to constantly feed the monster. Eventually, you want to get to the point where you're not worried about feeding the monster. The monster has food in the fridge and the freezer and down the road. And once you can get to that point, I think for me, from a financial perspective, I started to feel much better about things. We never got to the point where I had to worry about where the next gallon of milk was coming from for the kids, but there were projects where I'm like, how am I going to buy X, Y, and Z that I need for this because my credit isn't set up right? You learn about, oh, you don't want to have credit. Oh, yeah, you do. You want to be able to buy stuff for projects without having to ask for the client for money up front. So there's lots of different things that you learn along the way that will definitely keep you up at night.
Yeah. When you got to those points, what was the thing that pushed you forward? What made you take those steps forward?
You get to the why, right? Everybody talks about what's your why. My why was always my family, right?
Mm,
Making sure that family was taken care of was the primary driver, right?
yeah.
My wife doesn't work. She hasn't worked. She owns half the company, obviously. She doesn't work day to day in the company. So we have one income. So I better keep the wheels turning. All the kids are grown now. They're all adults and out living their own lives. And now it's more around growing the business and getting it to the point where I can step away and not have to be here every
Mm,
day. Go out on my boat on a Wednesday if I want to. That's been my saying because Wednesdays are never as busy as a Saturday or Sunday around here.
love that. I love that. I love to get back out in the boat. Everyone should have that dream. Wednesday boat day. The next section's MSP Growth Lightning Round. Just a couple quick questions. What's one disaster recovery horror story you've seen?
It didn't happen to us, but it's the reason that I was the CIO at the hospital in Dallas. The previous MSP, Fortune 500 MSP at that level for this hospital had a little problem with their backups. And the hospital needed to restore and couldn't, I think they lost 7 days of data, 7 days of billing and revenue, and just a complete disaster. And it's the reason they looked for a new vendor. It's the reason that we migrated all their systems away. So that's probably the biggest error I saw. My personal one was very early on in my career.
Okay.
I was 20. It was my second IT job, and I was hired at a door manufacturing company to back up their System 36. Yes, you are not of a certain age. You have no idea what a System 36 is. So that turned into an admin job on the System 36 at that company. So I went from a 2 hour, 3 hour a night, just doing backups after hours to them hiring me on full time. And then the manager, there was only two of us there. He left. And so at 20 years old, I was put in charge of this multi-million-dollar door manufacturing company's IT. And
Wow.
one of the things that we were having issues with on that particular device is that things ran really slow.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it was COBOL, either COBOL or Fortran, one of those two that it was written in. And so I started reading the books about it ran a program called MABIX, stand for Manufacturing, Accounting, Purchasing, Inventory Control System. So it managed all the aspects of what it took to build a door, basically.
Right.
And what I discovered is that they were out of disk space.
Mhm.
And back then, disks were as big as monitors are, bigger than monitors are today. And I thought, okay, if we're running out of disk space, clear disk space. So I started figuring out where dead files were and things that could go away. And I started clearing out disk space and the system got faster. And people were actually noticing that things were better. My backups were taking less time. And that was great until I got too aggressive. And I wiped out purchasing module, the entire purchasing database for the day. I restored it. We lost a day, basically.
Okay.
And back then there was enough paper trail that they weren't very happy. They had to rekey everything back in,
Mm.
but they could rekey everything in. But I wiped out the entire purchasing database for our organization at a very young age. I learned a very interesting lesson about making sure you verify before you hit that delete button.
Right. Lessons learned. Lessons learned. So, if you could give every IT professional one piece of advice, what would it be?
Grow your craft. T is not an 8 to 5 job. If you're truly an IT person who really loves what you do, you're constantly learning and you're learning outside of what you do at the office. For me personally, especially when I was younger, I breathed, slept IT, right? Technology. I wanted to learn as much as I can. And I think in some cases, one of the things that I've run across recently is I'm going to learn something. You as my business, my employer has to teach it to me. And I think you can only go so far that way. I think there's a lot of things that maybe we don't even do. Technology is a huge playing field. And we only do, I don't care what you do, you only use a fraction of it. Whether you're in cybersecurity, a managed service provider, networking, you're only utilizing a fraction of what is available out there in technology. So even if it's outside of what you consider your realm of what you do on a day-to-day basis, there's a lot of value in learning things both within that are going to help you in your day-to-day and outside of that, because inevitably whatever you learn from the outside is actually going to help you as well in some way or manner, either someday down the road or in your day-to-day job.
Great. If you could go back to year one of your MSP, what's one thing you would change?
I probably would have done it earlier. I wouldn't have waited to be told that go do something, go start. I think I wished I would have started sooner and not spent so much time looking for work. I was already pretty put off from corporate world. And if you work in the corporate world, especially right now is a great example. A lot of people are being laid off. There's a lot of rifts going on. And we see this in corporate America quite a bit. There's house cleaning that happens on a pretty regular basis, especially in larger organizations. And large organizations, at the end of the day, they just don't care. They're really based on revenue and numbers and profit. So to put my destiny in my hands, which really is what that does, being an entrepreneur, is it's scary. I worked harder than I ever worked in corporate America, but way more satisfying and just for me personally, a much better lifestyle and much better for me to know that there's not somebody else controlling my destiny, whether I'm going to paycheck next week or not.
Yeah, that's great. One of my favorite things about working with MSPs in the growth program is seeing how small shifts, whether it's pricing, hiring, or positioning, can completely transform their business. Was there one shift in your business that made everything easier?
I think the shift that is going to make it easier and a late decision for my part is really focusing hard on the otolaryngology groups that we already are serving. We've been serving that group for over a decade now, but making that choice to just focus on them and really make our business about being the number one provider of services to that group. We are marketing and really focusing just on ENTs, otolaryngology and audiology right now. And I think that decision is going to make life easier because it really does. It makes us focus more on who our core audience is because it's very well defined. And I know exactly the size of a practice that I'd like to go after, this size or bigger. And I know if I work outside that bound, I know what I'm getting myself into because I'm very familiar with that group. And I think that's sometimes a lot easier than just taking whatever comes in, which is what we do very early on, right? We take whatever comes our way. And I was just having this conversation with a buddy of mine who runs the MSP right next door to me. We have worked out that we have office space right next door to one another. And we talk a lot because our businesses don't intersect. We're both MSPs. We both provide very similar services. My services just happen to be focused in healthcare and nationwide, where his services are more small, medium-sized businesses here locally in Southwest Florida. We were just talking this morning about how we've grown from taking whatever comes our way to really focusing on we know we can support and what we need to focus in on as far as our marketing and our sales strategy.
Yeah, and that's such an important one because there was actually a time that before I was in this industry that I hired an MSP and I had talked to a bunch of them. I actually didn't know what an MSP was at the time and they just weren't speaking to me. I didn't understand what they were talking about. I didn't quite understand the services. But then a nonprofit specialized one came and talked to us and actually named the software that I had been having so much problem and couldn't figure out how to use. And it was like the heavens opened up and there was a choir of angels singing because it was like, oh, this is it. And when you can talk the talk, you become indispensable. When you know exactly who that vertical is and you really have your audience narrowed down and you can speak to them, really speak to what their problems are. And that's such an important thing, is to really know that audience and know what their issues are. Yeah.
It is. And it's scary, right? I can walk into any ENT practice and identify 10 things that they probably need help with.
Yeah.
And I can meet with them and talk to them about their applications that they're using. There's a lot of EMRs. There's only a few that private practice ENTs typically use. There's in audiology, they almost always use the same software across the board. Almost every audiology group uses that software or a version of that software. And they're very difficult to deal with. Once you're able to come in and show that you are an expert in those areas and you understand not just the technology, but you also understand their business, right? Because there's a lot to running practice beyond just getting on the computer and helping patients. There's the reimbursements and making sure that their systems are all running. And if they're on-premise EMR or if they're cloud-based, however they're structured, that you're able to provide value across the board for their entire practice and understand their entire practice from the time the patient walks in to the time the patient leaves and that reimbursement comes through the door. And being able to have that conversation, not just about IT, but about business and
Yeah.
about business continuity and about helping them grow and what you've seen other practices do. I get questions all the time. Well, what are other practices doing for this? It's happening a lot now in AI. What are other
Mhm.
practices doing when it comes to this technology, or how are they implementing it? Or what other practices are going to this EMR? Or what can you tell me about this EMR? So there's a lot of value in really understanding your client, whether you're focusing on lawyers, engineering, whatever it happens to be. If you can really prove yourself within that group, I think it really does serve you better.
Yeah. I would agree with that. And you've had a big success there. Last question. When you look back at everything you've built, what are you most proud of?
Oof, that's hard for me. There's parts of me still chasing success, right? People look at it and they say, you've done really well. You're a successful entrepreneur. Look at what you built. You got this company where you live, whatever it happens to be. And in my mind, I'm still just that kid who grew up in a trailer on a dirt lot in Oklahoma. So it's really hard for me to say, look and say, what am I most proud of? But I think just the fact that I'm sitting here today talking to somebody about a journey that I thought was not possible
Mm.
and having achieved professionally, personally, financially, goals that I thought were not achievable is probably the part that I'm most proud of, is that I found out that you're only limited to what you limit yourself to.
Yeah.
You have no idea what you're capable of until you put yourself outside your comfort zone.
Yeah. And what a role model and what an example you've been to your kids. They've been a part of this whole story that you've told us today, from the early days of trying to figure out how you were going to get Christmas presents and started selling bikes and flying around to different states and celebrating Christmas in New Jersey. But you showed them all along that it can get tough, but you just keep pushing forward because you have to bet on yourself. And that's been your story today. And I really thank you for sharing that. And that's a wrap on today's episode of the MSP Growth Podcast. If Joe's story inspired you, let us know. Hit subscribe, leave a review, or connect with us online. And if you're an MSP looking for your next breakthrough moment, check out the Gozynta Growth Program, where we help MSPs fine tune their strategy, streamline operations, and take their business to the next level. Until next time, keep growing, keep learning, and remember, every challenge is just another chapter in your success story. See you next time.